One of the biggest stories of 2019 was undoubtedly the OPCW's Syria scandal, a cover-up inside the world's top chemical weapons watchdog that was used to justify US-led military strikes on Syria. Leaked documents and testimony show there were serious doubts inside the OPCW about the allegation that the Syrian government committed a chemical weapons attack in the city of Douma in April 2018. Inspectors who were on the ground in Douma complained that their findings were distorted and excluded. According to one OPCW whistleblower who spoke to the British journalist Jonathan Steele, this censorship was done under direct US government pressure. According to a new batch of documents released by WikiLeaks, a top OPCW official ordered the removal of a critical document from the organization's secure registry. The document was a detailed engineering study that cast major doubt on the allegation that the Syrian government dropped gas cylinders on Douma. Another leaked document shows the OPCW consulted with toxicologists to determine whether symptoms observed in victims at the scene were consistent with exposure to chlorine. According to minutes of that meeting, quote, the experts were conclusive in their statements that there was no correlation between symptoms and chlorine exposure, unquote. But these key findings, and many others, were kept from the public when the OPCW released its final report. Ignoring its own data and experts, the OPCW concluded that there were, quote, reasonable grounds that the use of a toxic chemical as a weapon took place. This toxic chemical contained reactive chlorine, unquote. But even now, as the suppressed findings come out via brave whistleblowers and WikiLeaks, they are still being kept from the public. That is because the Western media, including top progressive adversarial outlets, have ignored or whitewashed the story. And that media self-censorship has become a scandal in itself. Well, earlier I spoke to Ted Postol, award-winning professor of science, technology, and national security policy at MIT. Welcome, Professor Postol, back to Pushback. We've discussed this scandal many times now. There have now been multiple sets of leaks released by WikiLeaks. As you read over them, what is your overall assessment of what took place inside the OPCW?
Well, I think that some people may try to argue that there was somehow a difference of opinion among experts. At least that's some of the rhetoric I've heard. And I think when you look at the original report, that is to say the report that was written by the professional staff and intended for the UN Security Council, and then you look at the report that was instead sent to the UN Security Council, I would say there is no doubt that the second report, the report sent to the Security Council, was not an accident. It was intentional. And the reason I have reached that conclusion is that the report that was sent to the Security Council not only comes to the opposite conclusions, which some people might argue is just because of differences among experts, but what is in this report that was sent to the Security Council are diagrams and figures that have nothing to do with the findings that are in that altered report. And if you look at the diagrams and figures in this altered report, not only do they have nothing to do with the findings, they are actually in some cases contradict the findings. So I can only guess. I'm speaking as a person who has a high level of technical skills who reads this document, but it appears to me that this was designed to intimidate non-specialists, who are basically most of the people who read this document. Most people they're not stupid or uneducated, but they're not specialists, and so they see these graphs and figures, and they just assume that these graphs and figures actually mean something. But in fact, they're meaningless. They're just there to divert attention from the fact that the report is inconsistent with its own claims.
And what is amazing now is reading over the documents from WikiLeaks that have been released, provided to them by people inside the OPCW, is the outrage that these experts are showing in objecting to their superiors and protesting the fact that all of their findings are being kept out of the final report, and that the process itself is not involving the people who are actually on the ground in Douma.
Well, I think it's worse than that. It's excluding them, and it's not just not involving them. It's bringing in people, whoever they are, we don't know who they are, who are committed to providing a false representation of what was found. They obviously have other people involved. We know that from the memos, and these people have no commitment to the truth. And it's obvious, and I think this is a good sign, that the staff people at the OPCW, the regular staff, the real people who do the work on the ground, are committed to getting the truth out. So that's a good sign. The problem is if the leadership of the UN, particularly I think the Secretary General has to be called to task on this. If the Secretary General does not step in on this and have an independent review, I think that the weight of the threats and literally probably removing people and firing them could gut the OPCW for a very long time, possibly forever. We saw this during the lead up to the Gulf War of 2003, where John Bolton, the then U.S. ambassador to the UN, literally ran Jose Boustany out of the job of being Director General of the OPCW. Boustany was a very distinguished and accomplished diplomat, and people don't always appreciate that diplomats are superb managers when they're good. I mean, it's not an accident that Boustany was on a short list for a Nobel Peace Prize because of his work setting up the OPCW. He did a brilliant job. He got very good people. It's obvious he got very good people just from what we're seeing now. And now there's an attempt on the part, I think, of the U.S. government, the British government, and the French government to destroy the professional integrity of the OPCW. This is extremely serious.
Well, and we have some evidence of that because, as I mentioned earlier, Jonathan Steele, the veteran British journalist, former chief foreign correspondent for The Guardian, he spoke to one of the whistleblowers. I believe the whistleblower who was not Ian Henderson, the author of that leaked engineering report, somebody else who he identifies as Alex. And Alex, the pseudonym for the whistleblower, says that 3 U.S. officials showed up at the OPCW as all this internal debate was happening, as all of these experts were objecting to the exclusion of their findings on the ground in Douma. And Alex relays that 3 U.S. officials came in and told them that basically, no, the finding is that Bashar al-Assad's government committed this chemical weapons attack, and this has to be the OPCW's conclusion.
Well, the only reason that Americans could be at this thing would be if they chose to provide intelligence in support of their claim. Otherwise, they should have been bounced on their head out of the meeting, because it's the OPCW staff, assuming they're competent, and it appears like they are very competent, who have to debate the issues and understand the technical detail. The Americans represent the American government, not the UN as an independent source of judgments that are related to international law. The UN is responsible for maintaining its independence as a source for judging whether international law was violated. And in fact, the Ambassador Arias, in my judgment, should be removed from the position he's in. The fact that he allowed this to occur, and in fact, I think it's been more than allow it to occur, it looks like he has been carrying water for the Americans, Brits, and the French on this. And he should be bounced out of the UN as far as I can see.
And it's striking, you mentioned earlier Jose Boustany, the first Director General of the OPCW. He is among those who have, and yourself included, who are calling for the OPCW to hear from these experts, the ones that they ignored. But Jose Boustany's call so far has not been heeded. I want to go back to the Henderson.
But sorry to interrupt you, but I want to underscore again, the Secretary General of the UN is responsible for this. People have to hold the Secretary General to account. If the Secretary General is not up to this, then they probably should find another Secretary General at the UN.
Well, the problem is there's a pattern of when UN officials are not up to the task of following U.S. orders, they, like Jose Boustany and many others, get bounced. Yeah. But let's go back to the first document that we saw that raised internal questions, which is the engineering report from Ian Henderson. I'm going to ask you to give us, Professor Postol, a condensed version of what Henderson found, because the technical stuff is difficult for those of us who are not educated in science and physics to follow. So what was the main import of Henderson's findings? Findings that, of course, were completely excluded from what the OPCW put out publicly.
Well, to make a very simple summary and then elaborate shortly, he found that the two sites called Location 2 and Location 4, there were two sites that where chlorine cylinders were found, where allegedly there was a chlorine release, and that's Location 2 and 4. At Location 2, he found that there was a chlorine cylinder that was made to look like it was stuck through the roof of a building, so that it had injected its chlorine gas into the building from the rooftop. He found that the hole in the roof had been produced by an explosion, probably from a mortar shell or an explosively armed artillery rocket. Now, the reason this was very clear, I want to underscore this is very clear. The rebar, the concrete roof has has rods of metal running through it to strengthen it. If you look at the hole from inside the building, because they're photographs from inside and outside the building, you can see that the rebar, the metal rods, are blown outward, sort of like the petals of a flower that was pointing through from the top of the building. That is only an effect of a high explosive event, and the high explosive event produces such intense high pressure gases that it literally would blow the rebar out into this splayed out pattern. On top of that, he points out that the size of the hole associated with the cylinder is about, the diameter of the hole is almost twice the diameter of the cylinder. When a cylinder hits a brittle concrete surface, it makes a hole that's roughly the same in diameter as the cylinder itself. It's sort of like, think of it as taking a nail and punching it through the surface. The hole should not be twice the diameter of the nail. There'll be some what are called spallation at the front and back, the top and the bottom of the hole, but the hole itself will be the same diameter as the cylinder itself. It shouldn't be more than or almost twice the diameter. So that's another clear indicator. A third clear indicator is that when the cylinder is supposed to be hitting, it didn't hit the roof, but supposedly be hitting the roof and penetrating through the roof. The rebar, these rods of metal, is very, very strong. So when the cylinder is penetrating through the concrete and it encounters a piece of rebar, the rebar will cause a crease in the cylinder. There are no creases in the front of this cylinder, which would have been caused by the rebar. So none of these things fit what would be absolutely expected if this in fact was caused, if this hole was caused by the impact of the cylinder. In addition, the cylinder should have fallen through the roof if you look at its disposition, because if it blew all the rebar out, momentum and gravity would have caused it to fall through into the room below, and it didn't. Now, if you look at the report, the falsified report, they actually, the OPCW fraudulent writers, the writers who participated in the fraud, put a simulation, a computer simulation of a cylinder passing through the roof. They actually have it there with diagrams, and of course what the simulation shows, when you look at the simulation carefully, it shows that the size of the hole in the roof is equal, the diameter of the hole is equal to that of the cylinder. So the information that they put in the report to produce a false impression to a non-specialist that there was actually something behind their finding contradicts what they show in their own photographs. So it's sort of amazing.
So we don't just have censorship here, we have outright fraud.
I think it's outright fraud. There's no question about it. This is not an accident. This was a real clumsy but serious attempt to create a product that looked like it was real.
And this brings us to one of the latest document releases from WikiLeaks, where there's an internal email from Sebastian Braha, who is chief of cabinet at the OPCW, a top-ranking official there, and he orders internally that Ian Henderson's engineering report, the one that revealed all this, that revealed the findings that Professor Postol just laid out, Braha orders staffers to remove Henderson's report from the internal server. He says this, quote, "Please get this document out of the documents registry archive, and please remove all traces, if any, of its delivery, storage, whatever, in the documents registry archive." So an act there of direct internal censorship. Let me ask you, Professor Postol, about the media censorship here, because all this stuff has come out. Generally, when WikiLeaks releases internal documents from something, whether it's the Iraq war files or whether it's the DNC emails, it gets a lot of media attention. On this issue, there's been virtual media silence. So let me ask you, you've written for the New York Times before. Your studies have been cited before by the New York Times, including on the issue of chemical weapons allegations in Syria. Has the New York Times contacted you at all for any comment on this story?
No, the New York Times is, as far as I know, is dead on this issue. I had quite a while back, maybe several months back, I attempted to talk with, I'm blocking his name now, a reporter who covered, who had a front page story that was wrong, Chivers.
C.J. Chivers, yeah.
Yeah, C.J. Chivers. And he published a front page story that was absolutely wrong. He was correct. He was corrected. And then he wrote a corrected story that was hard to understand, that it was really a correction. It was buried on page 8 in a corner of the newspaper a few days later. He quoted the same people who had given him the wrong story as if they had something reliable to say. I had recontacted him. It was just I'm sorry to say it this bluntly, but it was a display of cowardice like I haven't seen for a long time. He just had nothing to say in his defense.
Well, I want to also point out that this is not just the corporate media who, there's a history there of the corporate media silencing stories that undermine establishment narratives. But in this case, I've been really disappointed to see that this also extends to adversarial progressive media as well. And I want to ask you about two examples. One is The Intercept. They published a number of stories that advanced the narrative that Assad was guilty of this attack. You were interviewed for a story that offered that took sort of a neutral stance on it. It was sort of back and forth. It was back in February 2019. Since these revelations have come out, nothing in the Intercept at all. Have they contacted you at all for an interview about this?
No,
okay.
Not at all.
Democracy Now!, which is a very prominent progressive show. The reason I had your phone number to be able to interview you here at the Grayzone is because I used to work there for 10 years, and we used to interview you pretty often, especially when you did your work around Gaza and exposing that the Iron Dome missile system sold to Israel by the U.S. was basically a fraud. Have they contacted you at all?
No, no, dead silence from them.
And me,
Well,
yeah,
go ahead.
no,
It's there's other interesting things developing now. This is this is happening as we speak. I received a letter that was sent actually to a colleague of mine from the people at Princeton University, this journal called Science and Global Security. And it's not been in the news much, but we had a paper on Khan Sheikhoun that was refereed and accepted for publication that was inexplicably pulled from being published.
and just to explain quickly, Khan Sheikhoun, that was an attack in April 2017, a alleged chemical weapons attack that also prompted U.S. airstrikes on Syria.
That's correct. And that report from the UN OPCW was as badly compromised as the report on Douma. The report on Douma is getting a lot of attention now, as it should. But this other report was absolutely as badly compromised. That is to say, it was clearly and unambiguously a fraud. And my colleagues and I did a very detailed, we even did supercomputer calculations to show that the claim in the OPCW report was false. The paper was refereed and accepted by this Princeton-based journal, and then inexplicably, the editors of the journal said they weren't going to publish it, and then they had some silly arguments, which are really not even worth repeating because they were so obviously not true. And then in this letter we just got the other day, it appears that they're saying, I want to be clear here, we don't yet know. I'm preparing a letter to them right now, about to ask them. It appears that the reason this article was all of a sudden pulled after it was refereed and accepted is because the publisher, Francis and Taylor, which is a British-based publishing firm, objected to publishing the article. That's the way it looks. And if that's true, the next letter we write will be to the president of Princeton University to find out if Princeton University thinks that a publisher in England should have the right to determine whether a refereed article out of a Princeton-based journal should be acceptable or not. So this is a new wrinkle in this whole affair.
Finally, I want to ask you about the group Bellingcat. You have speculated that they may have played a role in the OPCW fraud. This is a group that receives funding from Western governments and is increasingly relied on in the media. And, I should say that the New York Times has not completely censored the OPCW story. There was one mention of it, but it's interesting. It comes at the bottom, buried inside a profile of this group Bellingcat, where it mentions the OPCW leaks kind of in passing. That's the only time I've seen it mentioned in the New York Times, in this profile of Bellingcat. And the Bellingcat story is called, "These reporters rely on public data rather than secret sources." And I want to read you a quote from this article because it's quite striking, and it's especially important if, in fact, it emerges that Bellingcat did play a role in the OPCW fraud. And we can talk more in a second about why they might have. But they're profiling Elliot Higgins, who was the founder of Bellingcat. And they have this line, quote, and it's not a joke. They say this, quote, "Mr. Higgins attributed his skill not to any special knowledge of international conflicts or digital data, but to the hours he had spent playing video games, which he said gave him the idea that any mystery can be cracked," unquote. That is an actual line, Professor Postol, in the New York Times.
The question I have is, if I were an editor knowing nothing about this story that had been given to me, typically what happens is you have the journalist writes the article and the editor reviews it. I would have said, you can't write this. This is ridiculous. You'd have to be a totally illiterate person to believe that playing video games gives you insights into how to be a journalist. How could you be that illiterate? I mean, to me, it's astonishing. It speaks as well about the editor who reviewed this thing as well as the writer, not to mention Mr. Higgins. It's just so extraordinary to me that I just don't know what else to say other than what I've already said about it.
Well, and the reason why it's so important is because it's not just that they're getting profiled in this way in the New York Times, is that their work, quote unquote, might have been relied on by the OPCW, and there are a few clues about that. One is the fact that in Bellingcat's own documents, they talk about the fact that they've collaborated with the OPCW, although they don't specify how. And second, you've highlighted this, that going back to the Ian Henderson document, the leaked engineering report, there's a reference in there to what he calls, quote, supposed experts, unquote, consulted by the OPCW, and you've taken that as a reference to Bellingcat.
Well, I don't know if it's a reference to Bellingcat or other supposed experts, but it could well be a reference to Bellingcat. It looks to me, from reading Bellingcat's materials on Khan Sheikhoun, there are a lot of the, quite frankly, false arguments from the Bellingcat materials that are just repeated in the UN report on Khan Sheikhoun. Let me just give you an example. Bellingcat claimed that they had a video that showed bombs were dropped in Khan Sheikhoun on the day of the attack in April of 2017. Well, you look at the bomb debris clouds. The bomb debris clouds are drifting in the opposite direction from the wind speed. That same claim is made in the UN report. Now, how could the UN report get it so wrong, especially when you look at something like this Henderson report, which is a highly professional document? I mean, when you read that report as a professional, I'm just saying it as a person who works as a technical person, who respects or doesn't the kind of work I see. I mean, I'm filled with admiration for the professionalism that's displayed in the way this report is presented, to another technical expert. It's clearly a very high quality document. So when I look at that, I say a man like Henderson couldn't make such a stupid, trivial error. If this is the quality of the people in the OPCW, the technical skills, it's very, very high. This is just the only kind of ridiculous thing that a guy like Mr. Higgins could make. I mean, those people who follow this can find this debate, if you want to call it that, between Higgins and me on YouTube. He couldn't answer any question. I don't even think he knows which way the gravity points. It's unbelievable how little this man actually knows that's related to reality. So how could you call this person a master journalist?
Well, I think, and I think unfortunately the same question applies to many people, many actual journalists who have completely ignored this story. And on that front, I want to ask you as we wrap, I wonder if you can comment on the professional risk that Ian Henderson and the other whistleblowers, whoever they are, have taken in coming forward as they have in leaking this stuff, and what is the impact on them and their work and their act here of bravery if pretty much the entire Western media, including adversarial outlets, so-called adversarial outlets, are ignoring what they've exposed?
Well, I have a personal reaction to this as well, because I was a tenured professor at MIT, and I pointed out that MIT was involved in lying to the Senate Armed Services Committee about a weapon system that couldn't work. And I was tenured. They couldn't fire me, but let me tell you, it was a pretty harrowing situation. These people are not tenured. And if they're doing what they are doing, they have chosen the jobs they're in because they are dedicated public servants. This is like running a military officer out of his or her career when they have dedicated themselves to the service of their country as a military person. There's no other thing they can do that will give them the same level of personal gratification and also self-fulfillment. And these people are risking, incredibly important features, aspects of their lives, because they would not be there if they weren't. These are very high quality professionals. They can obviously make much better salaries working in other organizations. They have gone to the UN because they are dedicated to service to, international law and justice. And these people are in risk of losing their opportunity to provide us with that very valuable service. So I take this very seriously, and I hold the press accountable for not doing what they should to help protect these people. I think it's criminal as far as I'm concerned. And, I have very strong feelings about this.
We'll leave it there. Ted Postol, award-winning professor of science, technology, and national security policy at MIT. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.